Enoch was a man who became godlike, and he built a city, and this city of Enoch became so holy that it transcended this dimension, as it's described in this book. There are certain signatures, and throughout Scripture, we see references to people getting keys, right? We've all heard about the keys of Peter, the keys of Melchizedek, the keys of Enoch. There's a book called The Keys of Enoch as well by J.J. Hurtak that's worth reading if you're interested to learn more about this. And I feel like there is this frequency, maybe it's a frequency connection, it might be an incarnation connection, that ties several of these people throughout history together. And they all have sigils as well, which is kind of interesting. Even as recently as someone like Saint Germain. Saint Germain was this very interesting character from like the 18th century that everyone thought lived for possibly hundreds of years even. He was very charismatic. He could hold a conversation, but he never ate at dinner. He didn't age, and that's what people claim about him. And you'll find him throughout history like involved in things like the American Revolution. He's like showing up in different places. And this guy's really interesting because he speaks many languages. He's extremely charismatic. And people thought he must be a charlatan because he couldn't possibly have done all the things that he seems to have known and done in his lifetime, because he had to have lived many lifetimes. So there's all kinds of huge lore around this guy. A lot of people believe that, again, tapping into that same frequency or possibly incarnation of Thoth, of Hermes. It kind of reminds me of the 7 Hermetic principles, which is cause and effect. That every cause has an effect and every effect has a cause. And that's how I feel about randomness. What is randomness? It's just a boundary condition where our knowledge ends and our ignorance begins. And as we expand human consciousness, we push the boundary out further and further. And that expands probably at something like the speed of light. Interesting that the universe is expanding about that same speed too. Maybe it's just our consciousness. There's a great quote by Max Planck, who was pretty much the mentor that made Einstein famous, because Einstein, working as a patent clerk, needed somebody to sponsor him, well regarded in the academic community, and that was Max Planck. Max Planck is famous for many things, particularly in quantum physics. Now, he and Einstein didn't agree on everything. He was more of the mindset that the universe is based on mind. He said, there is no matter as such. We must conclude that at the base of everything is really just a conscious mind. And when you think about it in those terms, you start to then realize, and that's why I've kind of come to the conclusion that we have a you and you have a you inverse around you. So all of it is a mental construct. We cannot separate. There is no such thing as true objective reality in the context that we all see the world through our own prism. So that is what we believe to be objective. We all think that our perception of a thing is objective, but as we start to expand our awareness, we realize there's different ways of looking at the same things or circumstances. When you realize that the universe is mental, and there's a reason why the first of the Hermetic principles is mentalism. It's so core to understanding all the rest. Each stacks on each other. And when you realize that, then you start realizing that every experience that you have is not just happening to you, it's actually happening for you. Whether you're conscious of it or not is up to you. You may not be aware of it until later on. And we just think that the world's happening to us. Oh my gosh, something bad happened. Oh, life is difficult. Woe is me. I'm a victim, blah, blah, blah. Well, or you can look at it differently and say, what is my you inverse or my subconscious mind, the lens through which I'm seeing the world, trying to teach me, my higher self, trying to project back to me so that I will come to that realization. You know, you could go to school for years and years and years and study the didactics, but until you experience it in some sort of a role play that you believe is actually real, you haven't really fully learned it. And so often people will say, well, what does all this stuff mean? You know, how does this help or save the whales? Or how does this save deforestation or whatever? If you actually study further into this, you'll realize that what we judge will just continue to be projected back to us. So in a way, when you start to really go down this rabbit hole of, okay, I'm going to be an advocate for this, that, or the other thing, by your own judgments of those things, you will only perpetuate those things. Hermes, you can learn a lot about him also. So there's several books. Kybalion is one by the Three Initiates, and you can listen to it on YouTube. It's fantastic. Around the same time, there was a translation that came out of the Emerald Tablets. So we're talking about the early 20th century. And in the early 20th century, there was kind of a bit of a mini renaissance that was happening. You saw a lot of advances in physics that was happening at that time, right? You saw people like Walter Russell. They started creating societies of like polymathic thought, like the Twilight Club in New York City that Walter Russell was a founder of. But basically, there was this small little mini kind of, I'd say, right around the turn of the century up until probably, the crash in 1929. There was this really interesting time happening. It was kind of the roaring 20s, and there was a very different philosophy and thought. Art was also exploding at that time. And what you find during that period of time is that people were going through these sort of expansions. You hear about also, leading up into that late 19th century, like Helena Blavatsky and Rudolf Steiner and other people that were kind of luminaries during this period of the world. And there was this expansion going on. So one of those things that came out of this was not only the work by the three initiates and the Kybalion, but also the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. Now, Emerald Tablets have been around for a long time, but there were different translations of it. This was a channel translation that was done by a guy by the name of Dorial. So I would definitely look into that because it tells a story also of Thoth, the Atlantean. So it goes all the way back in time and tells a story, and he actually claims in this writing that he built the pyramid. He was the designer of it. Now, it's funny because in Egyptian history, they tell the story of a guy by the name of Hemiunu. Hemiunu would have been the architect for the Great Pyramid. But Hemiunu sounds a lot like Hermiunu. It could definitely be some sort of connection between the two. And when you get into that, you can learn the whole story about how Atlantis fell and then how civilization was maintained, how they moved to Kem, the land of Kem, Egypt. And he was sort of like, you could think of him as the king of the land also for thousands of years, in fact. But basically, that story is worth reading. There's something about it where we all kind of have this ability to know if something is worth listening to or reading. And as the words permeate into your consciousness, there's something very powerful about that particular book. It's fascinating. And it's written in a very prose kind of way. So it's beautifully written. It feels like scripture. It's got this kind of holy feeling to it. And I probably read it and listened to it at least 200 times. And every time I listen to it or read it, I get something entirely new from it. Now that you've read Kybalion, if you haven't yet, you will soon. I'm sure that you will soon start experiencing more synchronicities. And this is one of the things that Carl Jung talks about. The surest sign of the path to enlightenment, or what he called the individuation process, is the number of synchronicities you start to register and experience in your day-to-day life. When we realize that it's all mind, we're all one, and we're all collectively connected through this consciousness. And then once you get past that notion, because it takes a lot to break away from materialism, to get into mentalism. But once you do, then you can go into correspondence. And that's the second principle of 7 Hermetic principles. And correspondence is embodied in the statement, as above, so below. What does that mean? I think the first place that I started to recognize that was before I even really knew much about any of this. I started to study fractal geometry. And what does fractal geometry even mean? So if you were to zoom in on a EKG of your heart wave, right? So you've got a QRS complex and a T wave, QRS complex and a T wave. But if you zoom in on the dead space in between, keep zooming in, you'll see the same wave again as a fractal form, a smaller form of it. It's not a coincidence now that we're now able to observe what it looks like to see a black hole as of a couple of years ago. And when that photograph got released on the internet of that, I can't remember her name, the woman who basically was doing the research and caught a photograph of a black hole. We're finding, again, we're pushing that boundary of ignorance farther and farther out, right? We still don't understand what is dark matter, what is dark energy. And as we start to understand this dark matter, dark energy, maybe this is really just an analog for the own aspects of our own subconscious mind we are yet to become consciously aware of. I think there's, amongst large circles within some of the physics community, as you continue to go further and further into this, we could go down this reductionistic path and just realize that every time we look for something, whatever we're looking for, we will find. what we get in this world is not necessarily what we deserve in life. It's what we expected that we were going to get. Whether you expected it consciously or you expected it subconsciously, and that manifested in anxiety, you are creating the living circumstance that we have on a day-to-day basis. 90% of what happens to us is not actually what happens to us. It's what we believed happened to us. Again, that's getting to that mental space of it's a mental universe. So what can I learn from this experience? Why am I projecting this experience? Or why am I seeing it through this prism? What is it that I can learn from this?